Today, former President Trump's White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, he declined to appear for testimony that he had been subpoenaed to give this morning. The investigation says that Mark Meadows is therefore likely to be found in contempt. He's potentially going to be criminally prosecuted for contempt. But Mr. Meadows ended the day today by suing the committee that's conducting the investigation in what appears to be an effort to drag this thing out, to slow it down. And on top of that, in another surprise today, we also learned that before Mr. Meadows decided to bail on his subpoenas and sue the investigation, he did hand over some materials to the committee that they find useful for their investigation. In a letter to Mark Meadows' attorney from the chair of the investigation, Congressman Benny Thompson today, Thompson writes this. He says, quote, "Despite your very broad claims of privilege, Mr. Meadows has produced documents that you apparently agree are relevant and not protected by any privilege at all. Those documents include an email from November 7th, 2020.
Okay, so we need to talk about what just happened because this is absolutely massive and it changes everything we thought we knew about the Trump legal saga. Mark Meadows, the guy who was literally at Trump's side during some of the most controversial moments of his presidency, has apparently decided that loyalty has its limits. And those limits? Well, they apparently end when you're staring down serious prison time yourself. What we're seeing here is nothing short of a complete and total implosion of the inner circle, and the ramifications are going to echo through American politics for years to come. This isn't just another legal development that'll fade into the background noise of cable news cycles. This is the kind of bombshell that fundamentally reshapes the entire landscape of what we're dealing with here. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
So, a text message with a member of Congress 3 days after the election about a plan to appoint alternate electors in certain states. Alternate electors, meaning that's having states declare that Trump won when in fact Biden won. Meadows, the White House Chief of Staff at the time, says, quote, "I love it," as in, I love that plan. Also, an email exchange the following day on the same topic, calling that sort of plan a direct and collateral attack after the election, a direct and collateral attack on the election results, having Republican-controlled states just declare that Trump won in states where he didn't win. Again, this is just a few days after the November election. We already know that Mark Meadows made a surprise visit to Georgia in December to look in personally on that state auditing and counting its votes. We know he also hosted the January 2nd conference call in which Trump repeatedly badgered and pressured Georgia's Secretary of State that he needed to find exactly enough votes to declare Trump the winner in Georgia, even though Georgia is a state that he lost. Meadows also repeatedly pressured Justice Department officials that they needed to open investigations into bogus and truly bizarre conspiracy theories about supposed fraud. He did that in late December and January. But now, today, these new revelations showing that Meadows was knee-deep in the deepest end of this stuff, trying to get states to send alternate electors declaring Trump the winner when Biden had won. He was knee-deep in this stuff in the immediate.
So let's break down exactly what happened because the details matter enormously in this case. According to multiple reports and courtroom sources, Mark Meadows has provided prosecutors with what can only be described as a treasure trove of damning evidence. We're talking emails, we're talking memos, we're talking call logs, we're talking firsthand testimony about private conversations that took place in the White House during those chaotic weeks and months following the 2020 election. This isn't some third-hand account from someone who heard something from someone else who might have been in the room. This is the chief of staff, the guy who was literally orchestrating the day-to-day operations of the executive branch during this period. When Meadows talks, people listen, and when Meadows testifies under oath, prosecutors absolutely salivate at the opportunity. Now, what makes this particularly devastating for Trump is the sheer scope of what Meadows has allegedly revealed. We're not just talking about one isolated incident or one questionable phone call. We're talking about a comprehensive pattern of behavior that prosecutors are describing as criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Meadows has reportedly detailed private White House conversations where Trump explicitly discussed plans to overturn the election results, where he acknowledged that certain fraud claims had no basis in reality, and where he directed his staff to pursue strategies that his own legal team had warned him were legally problematic at best and potentially criminal at worst. This is the kind of insider testimony that defense attorneys have nightmares about because it's nearly impossible to discredit when it comes from someone who was literally in the room where it happened. The fake elector plot is apparently a major focus of Meadows' testimony, and this is where things get really interesting from a legal perspective. According to the reports, Meadows has provided detailed documentation showing that Trump personally directed efforts to assemble alternate slates of electors in states that Biden had won. Now, if you're not familiar with this scheme, here's the basic idea. The plan was to have these fake electors cast their electoral votes for Trump, even though the actual certified results showed Biden had won those states. The hope was apparently that Vice President Mike Pence could then use the existence of these competing slates to either delay the certification or outright reject the legitimate electors in favor of the fake ones. It was, by any reasonable legal analysis, an attempt to subvert the democratic process through procedural manipulation and arguably fraudulent documentation. What makes Meadows' testimony so damaging here is that he's apparently confirmed Trump's direct involvement in orchestrating this scheme. This isn't speculation, this isn't inference. This is the chief of staff saying under oath that the president told him to make this happen. That kind of direct connection between Trump and the conspiracy is exactly what prosecutors need to overcome the inevitable defense argument that Trump was somehow insulated from the details or that he was just following advice from lawyers. When your own chief of staff is testifying that you personally directed him to pursue a plan that legal experts across the political spectrum have described as potentially criminal, you've got a serious problem on your hands. But it doesn't stop there, because Meadows has allegedly also provided evidence about Trump's state of mind during this period. And this is crucially important from a legal standpoint. One of the potential defenses that Trump's lawyers might try to mount is that he genuinely believed the election had been stolen and that he was acting in good faith to address what he perceived as legitimate fraud. It's not a great defense, but it's something they could potentially argue to try to establish that he lacked criminal intent. Well, according to the reports, Meadows has testified that Trump privately acknowledged that many of the fraud claims being pushed publicly had no evidentiary support. In fact, there's an alleged quote where Trump supposedly said something along the lines of not caring whether the claims were true or whether there was evidence to support them. If that testimony holds up, it completely demolishes any good faith defense because it shows Trump knew he was pushing false information and did it anyway. The January 6th attack on the Capitol is another area where Meadows' testimony is reportedly explosive. We already knew from previous reporting in the January 6th committee hearings that Trump watched the violence unfold on television and that he resisted calls from aides and family members to tell the rioters to stand down. But Meadows is apparently providing even more detailed testimony about those crucial hours, including specific conversations where Trump allegedly expressed satisfaction with what was happening or showed indifference to the danger facing lawmakers and law enforcement officers. This goes to the question of whether Trump attempted to obstruct the congressional certification proceeding and whether he failed in his duty to ensure that the laws were faithfully executed, which is a constitutional obligation of the presidency. There's also apparently testimony from Meadows about the handling of classified documents, which is a separate but related legal issue that Trump has been dealing with. According to reports, Meadows has provided information about Trump's awareness of rules regarding the handling of sensitive materials and about specific instances where Trump may have shown classified information to individuals who lacked appropriate security clearances. This corroborates other evidence that prosecutors have gathered in that case and helps establish that Trump knew what he was doing was wrong, but chose to do it anyway. The pattern that emerges from all of this testimony is one of someone who was repeatedly told that his actions were problematic, illegal, or unconstitutional, and who made a conscious choice to proceed regardless of those warnings. Now let's talk about the judge's reaction, because this is where things get really dramatic. According to courtroom observers and the reports that have emerged, the judge overseeing this case made some absolutely stunning statements after hearing Meadows' testimony and reviewing the documentary evidence he provided. The judge reportedly described the evidence as irrefutable proof of criminal conspiracy and obstruction, which is extraordinarily strong language from the bench. Judges typically try to maintain at least some semblance of neutrality during proceedings, especially before a verdict has been reached. So for a judge to use language like this suggests that the evidence presented was overwhelming in its clarity and damning in its implications. The judge reportedly went even further, stating that Trump faces immediate arrest, certain conviction, and likely life in prison based on the evidence that Meadows has provided. Now, we need to be careful here because this sounds almost too dramatic to be real, and there's a possibility that some of this language is being sensationalized in the reporting. But even if we discount some of the more theatrical elements, the basic message is clear. The judge believes that Meadows has provided evidence that fundamentally changes the nature of the case against Trump. The phrase that keeps coming up is that Meadows' testimony isn't just evidence, it's complete and total capitulation, meaning that Meadows has essentially given prosecutors everything they could possibly want to make their case. So what exactly did Meadows hand over that has everyone in such a state of shock? Let's dive into the specifics because this is where the legal rubber really meets the road. First and foremost, there are apparently extensive notes that Meadows took during meetings and phone calls throughout the post-election period. Now, if you know anything about the way Washington works, you know that senior officials taking contemporaneous notes is both common and incredibly valuable from an evidentiary standpoint. These aren't recollections from years later where memory might be fuzzy or potentially self-serving. These are notes taken in the moment, documenting what was said, who said it, and what decisions were being made in real time. According to the reports, these notes show Trump providing direct instructions to pursue various schemes to overturn the election results, including the fake elector plot we talked about earlier. But they also apparently document instances where Trump was told by White House counsel and other legal advisors that certain actions would be illegal or unconstitutional, and where Trump explicitly chose to disregard that advice. This is absolutely crucial from a prosecution standpoint because it helps establish both intent and knowledge. You can't claim you didn't know something was wrong when your own lawyers were telling you it was wrong and you proceeded anyway. That's consciousness of guilt, and juries tend to find that pretty compelling. Then there are the text messages and emails, which in the modern era have become the documentary trail that often proves decisive in high-profile cases. Meadows has apparently turned over communications between himself and various other figures in the Trump orbit, including lawyers, political operatives, and state officials. These communications allegedly show the coordination of efforts to pressure state legislators and election officials to either not certify Biden's victory or to somehow reverse the results after they had already been certified. We're talking about a multi-state operation that required significant planning and coordination, and Meadows was apparently at the center of much of it, acting on Trump's directions. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence, according to the reports, is documentation of Trump's interaction with state officials in Georgia. You might remember the infamous phone call where Trump asked Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find exactly enough votes to overcome Biden's margin of victory in the state. That call was already pretty damning because it was recorded and released publicly, but Meadows has apparently provided additional context and documentation about the preparation for that call and the follow-up efforts after it failed to achieve Trump's desired outcome. This helps prosecutors establish that the call wasn't some isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather part of a sustained and coordinated effort to overturn the election results through pressure on state officials. Meadows has also reportedly provided testimony about internal White House discussions regarding the Department of Justice and efforts to use federal law enforcement resources to investigate or validate Trump's fraud claims. We already knew from previous reporting that Trump had pressured DOJ leadership to announce investigations into voter fraud, even when they had found no evidence to support such investigations. But Meadows is apparently providing additional detail about those conversations and about Trump's reaction when DOJ officials refused to comply with his demands. This goes to the question of whether Trump attempted to obstruct justice or abuse his authority as president to pursue personal political objectives rather than the interests of the country. Another area where Meadows' testimony is reportedly significant is regarding Trump's knowledge of the potential for violence on January 6th. According to the reports, Meadows has testified about discussions and intelligence briefings in the days leading up to January 6th where the potential for violence was explicitly raised. This contradicts any defense argument that Trump couldn't have foreseen what might happen or that the violence was a spontaneous eruption that no one could have predicted. If Meadows is testifying that Trump was warned about the possibility of violence and proceeded with his rally and his pressure campaign on Pence anyway, that's evidence of reckless disregard for public safety at a minimum and potentially evidence of intentionally inciting violence to disrupt the certification process. The classified documents issue is another thread that Meadows has apparently helped prosecutors pull on. According to reports, Meadows has provided information about Trump's handling of sensitive materials, including instances where Trump showed classified documents to visitors at Mar-a-Lago who did not have security clearances. Meadows has also reportedly testified about conversations where Trump discussed keeping certain documents rather than returning them to the National Archives, and where Trump may have directed staff to move or conceal documents in response to subpoenas or other legal demands for their return. This is obstruction of justice territory, and if Meadows can testify to Trump's direct involvement in efforts to conceal or withhold documents, that's a very serious problem for Trump's legal defense. What makes all of this particularly devastating is the cumulative weight of the evidence. Any one of these incidents might be something that Trump's lawyers could potentially explain away or minimize. But when you have a pattern of behavior documented across multiple different contexts and corroborated by contemporaneous notes, texts, and emails from someone who was in the room for all of it, the defense becomes exponentially more difficult. This is why insider testimony is so valuable to prosecutors, because it provides context and connection between different pieces of evidence that might otherwise seem disconnected or ambiguous. Meadows is essentially serving as the narrator who ties all of these various threads together into a coherent story of criminal conduct. Now, we should talk about why Meadows decided to flip, because that's obviously a question that a lot of people are asking. The most obvious answer is that he's looking to save himself from serious prison time. Meadows was facing his own potential criminal liability for his role in all of this, and cooperating with prosecutors is often the smart move when you're staring down federal charges. By providing testimony against Trump, Meadows has likely secured some kind of immunity deal or plea agreement that significantly reduces his own exposure. It's a classic prosecution strategy to flip lower-level participants against the bigger fish, and in this case, Trump is obviously the biggest fish in the pond. But there might also be an element of genuine disillusionment or betrayal that Meadows feels toward Trump. We've seen reporting over the past few years suggesting that the relationship between Trump and some of his former aides has soured, particularly among those who felt that Trump left them out to dry when they faced legal consequences for actions they took on his behalf. Meadows may feel that Trump didn't protect him or support him adequately when he started facing legal scrutiny, and that may have contributed to his decision to cooperate with prosecutors. There's also the possibility that Meadows has simply decided that he doesn't want to go to prison for someone else's decisions, and that preserving his own freedom is more important than maintaining loyalty to a former boss. Whatever the motivation, the end result is the same from a legal standpoint. Meadows has provided prosecutors with what appears to be a roadmap to convicting Trump on serious federal charges. The testimony and documentary evidence that Meadows has supplied addresses many of the key elements that prosecutors would need to prove, including Trump's direct involvement in various schemes, his knowledge that those schemes were legally problematic, his intent to interfere with legitimate governmental processes, and his willingness to disregard legal advice and constitutional constraints in pursuit of his personal political objectives. That's a prosecution's dream scenario, and it's a defense attorney's absolute nightmare. So where do we go from here? And what does this mean for Trump's legal and political future? Let's start with the immediate legal implications, because those are the most concrete and the most pressing. If the judge has indeed ordered Trump's immediate arrest, as the reports suggest, that's a stunning development that would represent an unprecedented moment in American history. We've never seen a former president arrested, much less on charges related to attempting to overturn an election and obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. The logistics alone would be extraordinary, from the Secret Service's role in protecting a former president who is in custody to the media circus that would inevitably surround such an event. The path from arrest to conviction obviously involves multiple steps, including arraignment, pretrial motions, jury selection, and then the trial itself. But if the evidence that Meadows has provided is as strong as the reports suggest, Trump's legal team is going to have a very difficult time mounting an effective defense. The most likely strategies would probably involve trying to discredit Meadows as a witness, arguing that his testimony is motivated by his own desire to avoid prison and therefore shouldn't be trusted. They might also try to argue that Trump was relying on advice from lawyers and therefore lacked the criminal intent necessary for conviction. But both of those defenses face serious obstacles when you have contemporaneous documentary evidence corroborating Meadows' testimony and when you have evidence suggesting Trump knowingly disregarded legal advice. There's also the question of what charges Trump might ultimately face. Based on the evidence that Meadows has reportedly provided, we could be looking at charges related to conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, and potentially even charges related to inciting or assisting an insurrection. Some of these charges carry very serious penalties, including lengthy prison sentences. The judge's reported comment about Trump potentially facing life in prison might be hyperbolic, but it's not outside the realm of possibility if he's convicted on multiple serious federal charges and receives consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. From a political standpoint, this development is absolutely seismic. Trump has been the dominant figure in Republican politics for nearly a decade now, and the possibility that he might be facing serious prison time fundamentally changes the calculus for everyone involved in politics. Republican officials who have been reluctant to break with Trump for fear of alienating his base now have cover to distance themselves by pointing to the seriousness of the legal situation. Donors who have been supporting Trump's political operation might decide that their money is better spent elsewhere if they believe he's going to be tied up in criminal proceedings indefinitely. At the same time, we shouldn't underestimate Trump's ability to rally his supporters and frame this as a political persecution. He's been remarkably effective at convincing his base that every legal problem he faces is the result of a corrupt system trying to take him down rather than the natural consequences of his own actions. The Meadows testimony might actually be used by Trump to reinforce that narrative, portraying Meadows as a traitor who sold out to the deep state rather than as a former aide telling the truth about what he witnessed. Trump's supporters have shown a remarkable willingness to dismiss evidence and testimony that contradicts their preferred narrative, so we shouldn't assume that even overwhelming evidence will necessarily erode his political support in the short term. The broader implications for American democracy and the rule of law are profound, regardless of what happens in the short term. If Trump is ultimately convicted on serious charges related to attempting to overturn an election, it would send a powerful message that no one, not even a former president, is above the law. It would demonstrate that the system has the capability to hold even the most powerful individuals accountable when they engage in criminal conduct. That's an essential principle in a functioning democracy, and proving that it still works would be enormously important for maintaining public faith in American institutions. On the other hand, if Trump is somehow acquitted despite what appears to be overwhelming evidence, or if he manages to delay proceedings long enough to potentially regain the presidency and then pardon himself or have the charges dismissed, that would send an equally powerful but much more troubling message. It would suggest that the system is incapable of holding powerful individuals accountable, and that political connections and resources can ultimately shield someone from the consequences of even serious criminal conduct. That's the kind of outcome that undermines faith in democratic institutions and creates cynicism about whether justice is truly blind or whether it only applies to those without sufficient power and resources. The precedent that this case sets will also be important for future conduct by presidents and other high-level officials. If attempting to overturn an election and obstruct the peaceful transfer of power results in serious criminal consequences, future officials might think twice before engaging in similar conduct. But if those actions don't result in meaningful accountability, it essentially provides a roadmap for future attempts to subvert democratic processes. The stakes here go well beyond just Trump's personal fate. This is about establishing norms and consequences that will shape American politics for generations to come. We should also consider the impact on the other individuals who were involved in these schemes and who might now be facing their own legal jeopardy. If Meadows has flipped and provided evidence against Trump, there's a good chance that other participants are going to start thinking about whether they should cooperate with prosecutors as well. We could see a cascading effect where more and more people decide that protecting Trump isn't worth going to prison themselves. That could lead to even more evidence and testimony coming out, further solidifying the case against Trump and potentially implicating other high-level officials who were involved in the various post-election schemes. The question of Trump's mental state and decision-making during this period is also worth considering. The portrait that emerges from Meadows' testimony is one of a president who was increasingly divorced from reality, who was willing to disregard expert advice, and who was focused almost exclusively on retaining power rather than on any genuine concern about election integrity or democratic principles. This raises uncomfortable questions about fitness for office and about whether there should be mechanisms in place to address situations where a president is making decisions that appear to be motivated by personal interest rather than national interest. Those are constitutional questions that go beyond the specific criminal case, but that are nevertheless relevant to the broader conversation about what happened. Looking ahead, the timeline for all of this is going to be crucial. If Trump is arrested immediately as the judge reportedly ordered, we could see proceedings move relatively quickly, at least by the standards of complex federal criminal cases. But there are also numerous opportunities for delay, from pretrial motions to appeals to potential health issues or other complications that could drag things out. Trump's legal strategy in his various cases has consistently been to delay, hoping that something will change or that he can run out the clock. That strategy becomes harder to execute when you're in custody rather than out on bail, but it's still something that his legal team will undoubtedly attempt. The media coverage of all of this is going to be absolutely relentless, and that presents its own challenges. Finding impartial jurors who haven't formed opinions about Trump's guilt or innocence will be difficult given the saturation coverage that any trial would receive. The judge is going to have to carefully manage the proceedings to ensure that Trump receives a fair trial, despite the intense public interest and media scrutiny. At the same time, the public has a legitimate interest in understanding what happened and in seeing the justice system work transparently. Balancing those competing interests is going to require careful judgment and probably some innovative approaches to managing press access and protecting the integrity of the proceedings. For Trump supporters, this is obviously a moment of crisis. Many of them have invested enormous emotional energy and political capital in defending Trump and in believing that the various investigations into his conduct are nothing more than politically motivated witch hunts. Meadows' betrayal, as they would likely characterize it, forces them to either continue doubling down on their support despite mounting evidence or to begin the difficult process of reconsidering their allegiance. Most will probably choose the former option, at least initially, because admitting error or acknowledging that they were wrong about Trump is psychologically very difficult. But some may start to peel away, particularly if they conclude that Trump's legal problems make him unelectable or that supporting him has become politically toxic. For Trump's opponents, this is obviously a moment of vindication, but it's also a reminder of how close we came to a successful coup and how fragile democratic institutions can be when they're tested by a president who is willing to put personal interest above constitutional obligations. The fact that it required Trump's own chief of staff flipping and providing evidence to potentially hold him accountable suggests that the system came dangerously close to failing. That should be sobering even for those who are celebrating the prospect of Trump finally facing consequences for his actions. The question we should all be asking is how to strengthen institutions and norms so that we're not relying on insider testimony and lucky breaks to hold presidents accountable in the future. In conclusion, what we're witnessing is potentially one of the most significant legal and political developments in modern American history. Mark Meadows' decision to cooperate with prosecutors and provide extensive testimony and documentation about Trump's conduct represents a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the case. If the reports are accurate and the evidence is as strong as it appears, Trump is facing the very real possibility of conviction on serious federal charges and significant prison time. That would be an unprecedented outcome for a former president and would have reverberations throughout American politics and society. Regardless of what happens next, the fact that we've reached this point demonstrates both the resilience of American democratic institutions and the serious challenges they face when tested by individuals who are willing to prioritize personal power over constitutional obligations. This story is far from over, and the coming weeks and months are going to be absolutely crucial in determining not just Trump's fate, but also the broader trajectory of American democracy and the rule of law. The betrayal by Mark Meadows may ultimately be remembered as the moment when the walls finally closed in on Trump, when the insider testimony and documentary evidence became too overwhelming to overcome, and when accountability finally caught up with actions that threatened the very foundations of American democracy. Whether that narrative holds up will depend on what happens in the courtroom and how the American people and their elected representatives respond to this moment of crisis and decision.